Geronimo's rise to Apache leadership after Mangus Coloradus's white flag Murde. Vengeance satisfied at Arispe, Geronimo believed his warrior's path might end. Then he witnessed something that shattered his understanding of white men's savagery. Two prospectors ambushing another, finding gold, then heating knives over flames to torture their victim. Even hardened Apache warriors couldn't stomach such a sight. "All white men are crazy," said Nietzsche, "and there are too many of them on Apache land." How could Geronimo protect his people from an enemy whose cruelty exceeded even the brutal standards of tribal warfare? Geronimo's changing perspective on white men. The blood had barely dried at Arispe when Geronimo began questioning his future. The vengeance he sought after losing his family at Cascaya had been satisfied, at least temporarily. For each Membrano killed in the Cascaya massacre, 2 rurals had fallen at Arispe. Justice, according to Apache understanding, had been served. Yet the question remained, what would guide his path forward? Geronimo's first encounters with white men had occurred years earlier, when American surveyors arrived to mark boundaries between the United States and Mexico following the 1853 Gadsden Purchase. These strangers carried strange instruments, made markings on paper, and placed stone markers across Apache territory without permission. The Apache observed them cautiously, but allowed their presence, seeing them as peculiar but not immediately threatening. That perception changed dramatically one spring morning in 1862. While hunting alone in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, Geronimo spotted a solitary white man leading 4 heavily laden burros along a narrow trail. The man moved with the wary caution of someone accustomed to danger, frequently scanning the surrounding terrain. His animals carried prospecting equipment and supplies typical of those seeking gold in Apache territory. Geronimo tracked the prospector from a distance, curious about his movements and destination. Hours later, the quiet scene transformed when 2 additional white men emerged from behind a rock formation, rifles raised. They shouted commands in English, forcing the lone prospector to raise his hands in surrender. "Your gold or your life," one demanded, his beard-framed mouth twisted in a cruel smile. The prospector protested, claiming he carried only supplies. Unconvinced, the ambushers roughly searched his packs, emptying each one until they discovered several small leather pouches. When they poured the contents onto a flat rock, Geronimo saw the glint of gold nuggets, the soft yellow metal the Apaches considered nearly worthless but which drove white men to madness. What happened next shocked even a warrior who had seen the brutality of tribal warfare. The ambushers bound the prospector to a juniper tree, built a small fire, and placed their hunting knives in the flames. When the metal glowed red, they pressed it against the man's skin, demanding information about the location of his claim. Geronimo involuntarily recoiled at the sight. Apache warriors occasionally tortured prisoners, but only to extract critical military information that might save Apache lives. Even then, the practice was considered extreme and unsettling. What he witnessed now was torture solely for material gain, a concept alien to Apache values. The prospector's screams echoed through the canyon as Geronimo silently retreated. He had no desire to intervene in what he considered white men's affairs. It never occurred to him that when other white settlers eventually discovered the murdered prospector, they would blame his death on Apache raiders rather than their own kind. That evening, Geronimo encountered Nietzsche, son of the great Chiricahua leader Cochise, at their predetermined meeting place after a successful antelope hunt. Nietzsche proudly described tracking a large herd across the grasslands. "The spirits favored us today," Nietzsche said, gesturing to the antelope carcass he had expertly butchered. "This herd was the largest I have seen in many seasons. What success did you find?" Geronimo hesitated before describing his observation of the white men. He recounted the ambush, the discovery of gold, and the torture in stark detail. Nietzsche listened intently, his expression hardening with each word. "All white men are crazy," Nietzsche declared, his voice tight with anger, "and there are too many of them on Apache land. They kill each other for yellow rocks while claiming our hunting grounds." Geronimo nodded but added an observation. "Their numbers have decreased recently. My scouts report many have left to fight each other in a great war they call civil war. They kill their own kind over differences we cannot understand." Nietzsche's eyes brightened at this information. May they succeed in destroying each other completely. This presents an opportunity for us to eliminate those who remain. We have already regained control of much territory, Geronimo agreed. Most white men now fear leaving their towns unless they travel in large, armed groups. When they venture out alone, they often do not return. The conversation revealed the practical analysis that guided Apache military thinking. Rather than viewing conflict through emotional or ideological lenses, Geronimo and Naiche assessed the situation strategically. The temporary reduction in white settlers, due to the American Civil War, presented a tactical advantage, one they intended to exploit. Their exchange also highlighted a fundamental cultural misunderstanding that would shape future conflicts. While Apaches viewed white settlers as invaders to be repelled from their ancestral territories, Americans considered Apache resistance as obstacles to manifest destiny and national expansion. This clash of worldviews made conflict inevitable. For Geronimo, the incident with the prospectors crystallized his understanding of the threat his people faced. The cruelty he witnessed exceeded even the harsh standards of tribal warfare. If white men treated their own kind with such savagery for mere material gain, what treatment could Apaches expect? This realization transformed Geronimo's approach to resistance. No longer simply avenging personal loss as he had at Arispe, he began developing a broader strategy for Apache survival against an enemy whose numbers, technology, and brutality presented unprecedented challenges. As dusk fell, the two warriors parted ways, each carrying portions of the antelope meat back to their respective camps. The knowledge they shared about white men's internal conflicts, their diminished presence, and their incomprehensible cruelty would inform Apache resistance strategies for years to come. The American Civil War had indeed created a temporary power vacuum in the Southwest, allowing Apache bands to reassert control over portions of their traditional territories. This brief period of relative Apache ascendancy would last until 1865, when Union forces, battle-hardened and equipped with advanced weapons, would return in greater numbers to the Southwest. For now, Geronimo carried both fresh meat and fresh resolve back to his people. The path ahead would require all his tactical genius and determination, qualities that would eventually make him the most famous Native American resistance leader in American history. Escalating tensions and memories of betrayal. Despite his agreement with Geronimo about their temporary advantage during the American Civil War, Naiche harbored deeper concerns about the future of the Apache people. The transient absence of military forces provided only a brief respite in what both warriors recognized as an inevitable conflict over territory and sovereignty. As they continued their discussion on the hillside, Naiche reflected on the gradual encroachment of white settlers. The first arrivals had been the boundary surveyors, who appeared in 1853 following the Gadsden Purchase. These strange men, with their instruments and markers, had initially seemed harmless. They completed their task of drawing invisible lines across Apache lands, and departed without establishing permanent settlements, leaving the Apache somewhat reassured that the intrusion would be limited. This reassurance proved short-lived. The surveyors were merely advance scouts for the true invasion. Next came gold prospectors, staking claims throughout Apache territory. Their numbers increased steadily throughout the 1850s, followed by ranchers, farmers, and merchants who viewed Apache lands as unclaimed resources awaiting exploitation, rather than ancestral territories of a sovereign people. Naiche recounted to Geronimo the infamous betrayal of Mangus Coloradus, the respected Membrano Apache leader. In 1857, Mangus Coloradus had generously guided white miners to gold deposits in the Sierra Madre Mountains during a period when Apaches did not yet understand gold's value to white culture. Rather than expressing gratitude, the miners grew suspicious of their guide's motives. They seized Mangus Coloradus, bound him to a tree, and beat him severely, treatment more brutal than anything Apaches typically inflicted upon Mexican prisoners. This incident permanently altered Mangus Coloradus's view of white settlers. Though he survived, the aging leader grew increasingly concerned about the superior weaponry of white armies. By 1862, he had begun expressing fears that once the Civil War concluded, white soldiers would return with even more terrifying weapons. Mangus Coloradus had recently suggested that peace might represent the only hope for Apache survival, a position Geronimo vehemently rejected. "Our only hope lies in fighting to protect what belongs to us," Geronimo had told the elder leader, revealing the growing strategic division among Apache leadership regarding resistance versus accommodation. The conversation then turned to another profound betrayal that had shaped Apache-American relations. Naiche shared the painful story of his father Cochise's experience with Lieutenant George Bascom in February 1861, an incident that ignited years of warfare between Chiricahua Apaches and Americans. Cochise had maintained peaceful relations with Americans, even protecting mail routes crossing Apache territory. When Lieutenant Bascom arrived at Apache Pass requesting a meeting, Cochise responded in good faith, bringing 5 warriors with him. Upon arrival, Bascom accused the Chiricahua of kidnapping a boy named Felix Ward, later known as Mickey Free, and stealing cattle from a local ranch. Though Cochise truthfully denied any involvement, Bascom refused to believe him and ordered the immediate arrest of Cochise and his companions. In the ensuing chaos, Cochise escaped by slashing through the tent wall, but his warriors were captured. Attempting to negotiate their release, Cochise captured several white hostages. When Colonel Isaac Lind, Bascom's superior, arrived at Apache Pass, the Apaches proposed an exchange of prisoners. Instead of negotiating, Lind ordered the execution of the Apache captives. Their bodies were left hanging from trees as a warning. In retaliation, the Apaches killed their white hostages. The Cut the Tent incident, as it became known among military historians, transformed Cochise from a peaceful leader into a determined adversary who would wage war against American forces for the next decade. Naiche had not witnessed these events personally, as he had been raiding in Mexico to avenge the Cascaya massacre during this period. Nevertheless, he understood that this betrayal had permanently altered Chiricahua relations with Americans. Naiche explained that while these events had forced the Chiricahua into war with white settlers, he believed his father still privately hoped for eventual peace. This admission revealed the complex internal tensions within Apache leadership, between resistance and accommodation, between protecting their way of life and adapting to changing realities. These conversations and shared memories reinforced both warriors' conviction that white encroachment represented an existential threat to Apache survival. The recurring pattern of betrayal, from the boundary surveyors who preceded settlement to the attacks on Mangus Coloradus and Cochise, demonstrated that peaceful intentions were consistently met with violence and deceit. Geronimo, his resolve hardened by these accounts, and his own observations of white cruelty, proposed immediate action. The 2 prospectors who had tortured their victim represented an opportunity to strike back against those directly responsible for violating Apache territory. He suggested returning to their camp for weapons, then tracking and killing the 2 men he had observed earlier that day. Naiche readily agreed. This decision represented more than simple revenge. It was a calculated military action intended to discourage further incursions into Apache territory. By targeting specific individuals who had demonstrated particular cruelty, rather than attacking settlers indiscriminately, Geronimo displayed the tactical thinking that would later characterize his leadership. The 2 warriors gathered their hunting spoils and headed back toward their camp. Their decision to take action against the prospectors would prove consequential, as it committed them more firmly to resistance at a time when other Apache leaders were beginning to consider accommodation as the only viable strategy for tribal survival. This period of escalating tensions between 1861 to 1863 represented a critical turning point in Apache-American relations. The temporary reduction in military presence due to the Civil War provided the Apache with a brief window to reassert control over their territories, but both Geronimo and Naiche recognized this advantage would not last. Their decision to continue resistance, informed by personal experiences of white betrayal and cruelty, set them on a collision course with the American military establishment that would define the remainder of their lives. Preparing for battle at Apache Pass, Geronimo and Naiche returned to their camp with the antelope meat only to discover an unexpected scene of activity. Women packed essential belongings, while children gathered in groups under the watchful eyes of elderly tribal members. Warriors moved with purpose, checking weapons and supplies. Several chieftains stood in a circle around Cochise, who issued instructions with the calm authority that had earned him respect throughout Apache territory. The planned hunt for the two gold prospectors would have to wait. Something far more significant demanded their attention. Cochise acknowledged his son's return with a brief nod before continuing to direct the evacuation. Apache scouts had brought alarming news. A large contingent of soldiers from the west, identified as California volunteers, was marching toward Apache Pass. Their ultimate destination appeared to be the Eastern Territories, where Union forces battled Confederate troops, but their path would take them directly through one of the most strategically important locations in Apache territory. Apache Pass represented more than just a natural pathway. The narrow gap between the Chiricahua and Dos Cabezas Mountains contained precious springs that provided reliable water in an otherwise arid region. For centuries, Apache bands had controlled this vital resource, allowing them to regulate movement through their lands. Now, uniformed soldiers intended to march through as if they owned it. Cochise had already dispatched runners to Mangus Coloradus, proposing a joint operation to ambush the California column at the pass. The plan was straightforward, but potentially devastating. Allow the soldiers to enter the narrow confines of the pass, then attack from the high ground with overwhelming force. With control of the water sources, the Apaches could ensure that any survivors would face death by thirst if they somehow escaped the initial onslaught. The camp transformed as warriors prepared for battle. Some applied war paint in traditional patterns, others checked firearms acquired through trade or combat, and all carried multiple weapons, from traditional bows and arrows to lances, knives, and tomahawks. The Apache warrior typically entered battle prepared to fight, at multiple ranges and with various weapons as circumstances required. Naiche quickly joined a group of Chiricahua warriors preparing their equipment. Geronimo sought out the Membrano fighters who had been his companions at Arispe. Though technically under different leadership, the two Apache bands were united in purpose, stopping the military advance through their territory. The scale of preparation indicated the seriousness with which the Apache leaders viewed this threat. Women and children rarely evacuated unless a significant conflict was anticipated. The California volunteers were not merely another party of gold seekers or settlers. They represented organized military force, the most dangerous expression of white encroachment. By nightfall, the camp had emptied of non-combatants. The women and children traveled toward remote mountain refuges, locations known only to the Apache and inaccessible except through narrow trails easily defended by small groups of warriors. These sanctuaries had sustained Apache populations through countless conflicts, providing security during periods of intense warfare. Geronimo studied the faces of warriors preparing for battle. Some were veterans of Arispe and other conflicts against Mexican forces. Others were younger men who had yet to prove themselves in major combat. All understood the stakes. This battle would not be about gold or local disputes, but about asserting Apache control over their territory against a military force representing the distant American government. The plan to eliminate the two prospectors Geronimo had observed earlier that day now seemed trivial compared to the approaching confrontation. Individual acts of violence against trespassers served a purpose in discouraging settlement, but stopping an entire military column would send a much stronger message. If successful, the ambush at Apache Pass might convince American forces to avoid Apache territory entirely, buying precious time for the tribe. As scouts reported the continuing advance of the California column, Apache warriors moved out in small groups toward predetermined positions surrounding Apache Pass. They traveled primarily at night, using minimal fires and maintaining strict noise discipline. By day, they rested in concealed locations, invisible to casual observation. This infiltration technique had served Apache fighters for generations, allowing them to position substantial forces without alerting their enemies. Geronimo joined a group of 30 warriors led by Victorio, a rising leader among the Membrano Apache. Their assigned position overlooked the mainspring at the pass, giving them a clear field of fire against anyone attempting to reach the water. The tactical significance was obvious. Soldiers marching through desert terrain would desperately need water upon reaching the pass. Controlling access to this essential resource gave the Apache a critical advantage. The journey to Apache Pass took 2 days of careful movement across familiar terrain. The warriors maintained separation between groups, but coordinated their progress to ensure all would arrive in position before the soldiers. Scouts shadowed the California column, providing regular updates on their position, speed, and composition. This intelligence allowed Cochise and Mangus Coloradus to adjust their deployment for maximum effect. By the time the Apache force had fully assembled around Apache Pass, their numbers had grown to nearly 700 warriors. The Chiricahua under Cochise composed the majority, with substantial contingents from the Membreno under Mangus Coloradus and smaller groups from allied bands. Against typical civilian targets, this would have represented massive overkill. Against trained soldiers with superior weapons, it provided the numerical advantage needed to overcome technological disadvantages. The night before the expected arrival of the California volunteers, Geronimo took his position behind a rock outcropping on the steep slope of the pass. He camouflaged himself with a saguaro cactus skeleton and arranged stones to provide additional cover. His weapons, a rifle, knife, and war club, lay within easy reach. Around him, other warriors similarly prepared, creating nearly invisible firing positions, with clear lines of sight to the trail below. From his vantage point, Geronimo could see the abandoned stone building that had once housed the Overland Stage Company station. Beyond it lay the springs, approximately 600 yards away. The California volunteers would need to secure both locations to safely transit the pass. The Apache plan was to allow them to approach the springs, then open fire from all sides simultaneously. Scout reports indicated the soldier column had stopped at Dragoon Springs, 40 miles west of Apache Pass, to refill water containers. This final intelligence confirmed what the Apache leaders had anticipated. The soldiers would likely arrive with depleted water supplies, making the springs at Apache Pass even more critical to their survival. The defensive positions constructed by warriors under Mangus Coloradus and Cochise on the heights overlooking the springs gave Geronimo confidence. Stone breastworks provided protection while allowing clear fields of fire. The soldiers would be caught in the open, exposed to fire from elevated positions, unable to effectively return fire against well-protected opponents. Among the gathered warriors, a sense of anticipation grew. This would not be a typical raid against isolated settlements or ambush of small parties. This would be direct combat against the military force of the American government. The potential victory, if achieved as planned, would rank among the greatest Apache military accomplishments, potentially driving whites from their territory for years to come. As darkness fell over Apache Pass, runners brought final reports. The California volunteers had resumed their march from Dragoon Springs. Most of their heavy supply wagons remained behind with guards, while the main column, cavalry and infantry, continued toward Apache Pass. The soldiers wore blue uniforms and appeared affected by the desert heat, suggesting vulnerability. The numerical advantage favored the Apache forces significantly. Scouts estimated the approaching military column numbered only a fraction of the assembled warriors, perhaps 1/6 their strength. Against untested troops marching through unfamiliar, hostile territory, the planned ambush seemed certain to succeed. Geronimo settled into his position, mentally rehearsing the coming battle. The hunt for the 2 gold prospectors had been forgotten, replaced by the immediate challenge of confronting an entire military column. The strategic significance far outweighed personal vengeance. If successful, this battle would not just eliminate individual trespassers, but might deter military expeditions through Apache territory altogether. As dawn approached, Geronimo and hundreds of other warriors waited silently, in concealed positions throughout Apache Pass. They would allow the California volunteers to enter the pass before Cochise fired the first shot, the signal to unleash a coordinated barrage from all sides. No soldier would reach the springs, and those not killed by Apache bullets would die of thirst in the desert. At least, that was the plan. The Battle of Apache Pass. At dawn, Geronimo detected movement in the distance. The California volunteers marched in formation toward the pass, their blue uniforms visible against the desert landscape. Naichi appeared silently beside him with final intelligence. "The bluecoats number fewer than we expected," Naichi whispered. "Most heavy wagons remain at Dragoon Springs. The soldiers look thirsty and weakened by the sun." Geronimo nodded with satisfaction. The Apache force outnumbered the soldiers by at least 6-1, and the terrain favored the defenders. Victory seemed inevitable. "We will kill them all before they reach the springs," Geronimo replied confidently. The soldiers entered the narrowest part of the pass in good order, apparently unaware of the hundreds of eyes tracking their movement. When the column reached the midpoint between the entrance and the abandoned station, Cochise fired the first shot, the signal to begin the assault. What followed was unlike any ambush Geronimo had experienced. Hundreds of rifles and bows unleashed, a devastating barrage from multiple elevated positions. Soldiers fell in the initial volley, but what happened next shocked the Apache warriors. Instead of panicking, the bluecoats responded with disciplined precision. Officers shouted commands, and the soldiers quickly formed defensive positions, returning fire while moving their wounded to safety. "These are not like the rurals," Geronimo muttered, watching the soldiers' effective response. Rather than fleeing in disorder as expected, the California volunteers executed a controlled withdrawal, maintaining their formation while continuing to fire at Apache positions. Their marksmanship was impressive even under pressure, forcing several warriors to abandon exposed positions. Frustrated by this unexpected resistance, Geronimo left his original location and moved toward the stone fortifications overlooking the springs. Here Mangus Coloradus had positioned his most experienced fighters to prevent the soldiers from reaching water. If the California volunteers couldn't be eliminated immediately, denying them water would eventually force their surrender or retreat. The battle intensified as soldiers regrouped and advanced again. Their rifles appeared newer and more effective than weapons Geronimo had faced in previous conflicts. The Apache warriors maintained superior positions in numbers, but the technological advantage of the soldiers' firearms partially offset these benefits. After several hours of fighting, a group of soldiers broke through toward the abandoned stone building. Moving with purpose, they reached the structure and established a defensive perimeter. Some took positions inside while others used the walls as cover, creating a small fortress from which they could protect their approach to the springs. Geronimo watched this development with growing concern. The battle was not proceeding according to plan. Despite inflicting casualties, the Apache force had failed to stop the soldiers' advance or break their formation. Now the bluecoats had secured a strategic position within the pass. Then came the most surprising development of the battle. As the soldiers pushed toward the springs, Geronimo noticed small wheeled carts being pulled behind their lines. Each cart carried what appeared to be a short, thick pipe mounted on wheels. He initially dismissed these as clumsy devices that demonstrated the soldiers' lack of experience in mobile warfare. "Look at the foolish things they drag through the desert," he remarked to a nearby warrior. No Apache would burden himself with such awkward equipment in battle. His confidence evaporated moments later, when the first artillery shell exploded against an Apache defensive position. The howitzer, for that was what these wheeled devices were, fired with devastating effect. One shell struck directly into a stone breastwork, killing 3 warriors instantly and scattering others in panic. The explosive force and deadly fragments were unlike anything in the Apache warriors' experience. Traditional warfare had not prepared them for artillery bombardment. When a second shell exploded nearby, the effect on Apache morale was immediate. Warriors who had faced gunfire stoically for hours began abandoning their positions, retreating higher up the slopes. Geronimo held his ground, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. He watched as soldiers advanced to the springs, filled their canteens, and withdrew to the stone building in good order. The carefully planned ambush had failed not through lack of courage or numbers, but because of weaponry the Apache had never encountered. Mangus Coloradus joined Geronimo on a high ridge as the fighting subsided. The aged leader stared down at the springs now controlled by soldiers, his expression revealing rare shock. "We could have killed them all," Mangus Coloradus said quietly, "but they fired wagons at us." The simple statement captured the technological gulf that had determined the battle's outcome. Despite superior numbers, knowledge of terrain, and carefully planned positions, the Apache force had been defeated by artillery they could neither counter nor comprehend. Yet Mangus Coloradus was not prepared to concede defeat. As dusk approached, he gathered his sub-chiefs to develop a new strategy. If the soldiers controlled the pass for now, they would still need to communicate with their base at Dragoon Springs. Intercepting messengers became the new objective. Later that night, Apache scouts detected the sound of hoofbeats. 5 riders were racing east from the stone building, clearly messengers bound for Dragoon Springs. Warriors quickly moved to intercept, unleashing arrows and rifle fire from concealed positions along the trail. 3 horses went down immediately. In the confusion, the uninjured riders pulled their companions onto their remaining mounts and continued fleeing, though at a slower pace. Geronimo and a small group pursued into the darkness. 1 injured soldier fell from his horse during the chase. The Apache warriors approached cautiously to finish him, but the wounded man was not defenseless. He fired his revolver when they drew near, the muzzle flash illuminating his desperate face for an instant. Mangus Coloradus grunted and fell backward, struck by the bullet. Geronimo and 2 other warriors immediately abandoned the pursuit to attend their wounded leader. In their haste to remove Mangus Coloradus from danger, they left the injured soldier behind, a decision they would later regret, when they learned he had survived to rejoin his command. The Battle of Apache Pass had revealed a harsh truth. Despite the Apache warriors' superior numbers, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and courage in combat, they had been defeated by technology they had never encountered. The howitzers represented a new type of warfare that traditional Apache tactics could not counter. As they carried the wounded Mangus Coloradus away from the battlefield, Geronimo reflected on the day's events. The confident prediction of victory had given way to a sobering realization. The white man's war machines could overcome even the most carefully planned Apache strategies. This knowledge would require fundamental changes in how the Apache approached future conflicts, changes that would test their adaptability and resolve in ways they had never anticipated. The California volunteers not only survived the ambush but secured Apache Pass, establishing a presence that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. For Geronimo, the battle marked a turning point in his understanding of what it would take to defend Apache lands against an enemy whose technological advantages would only increase with time. A wounded leader and the journey to Janos. The Membrano warriors gathered around their fallen leader, faces etched with grief and anxiety. Mangus Coloradus lay on a blanket, blood seeping through his buckskin shirt where the soldier's bullet had struck. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his normally commanding presence diminished by pain. The warriors understood that their future hung in balance with his life. Without his leadership, their strength as a nation would fracture. Negesi, an elder warrior respected for his wisdom, broke the tense silence. "We need a medicine man." Geronimo stepped forward with unexpected confidence. "I am a medicine man." The assembled warriors looked at him with surprise. Few knew that after the Cascaya massacre, Geronimo had immersed himself in healing rituals and ceremonies, hoping to discover powerful medicine to defeat those who had slaughtered his family. Though he had mastered the forms and words of these ceremonies, Geronimo privately harbored doubts about their effectiveness against serious wounds like the one Mangus Coloradus now suffered. Nevertheless, he knelt beside the wounded chief and began. From a small pouch at his waist, Geronimo removed a measure of hardened, sacred pollen considered among the most powerful healing substances in Apache culture. With practiced movements, he spread the yellowish powder across Mangus Coloradus's forehead, then drew a cross pattern on his chest. He scattered more pollen in a circle around the chief, then touched some to the foreheads of the warriors watching the ceremony. Finally, he applied the substance to his own forehead and consumed a small pinch. As he completed the ritual, Geronimo recognized its limitations. The bullet remained lodged inside Mangus Coloradus, and no amount of sacred pollen could extract it. A troubling realization formed: white men, for all their barbarism, possessed superior healing methods for such wounds. Their doctors could remove bullets and treat deep injuries in ways Apache medicine could not match. with the other warriors paralyzed by grief and no sub-chiefs present to take command. Geronimo made a decision that would alter the course of events. He began issuing orders with the natural authority of leadership, directing warriors to construct a litter for transporting the wounded chief. Young Mangus, son of the fallen leader, approached hesitantly. "Where will you take my father?" "To the Mexican doctor in Llanos," Geronimo replied without hesitation. The statement provoked immediate protest from Mangus. "The Mexicans are our enemies. They will kill him." Geronimo barely acknowledged the objection. He had observed both father and son for years and recognized that while Mangus Coloradus possessed rare wisdom and natural command, his son had inherited neither quality. The young man's protest carried no weight against the urgent need for action. Despite Geronimo holding no formal leadership position, the warriors followed his directions without question. His decisive manner conveyed authority, and in crisis, Apache bands naturally rallied behind whoever demonstrated leadership capacity. Some warriors gathered cottonwood poles and deerskins to fashion a litter, while others spread out to gather the remaining Membrano fighters scattered after the battle. As word spread of Mangus Coloradus's condition, warriors from throughout the band converged on their location. Young Mangus raised another concern, noting that if all the Membrano warriors departed, the Chiricahua would face the California volunteers alone at Apache Pass. "Let them," Geronimo responded coldly, unaware that the Chiricahua would indeed fight again the following day, suffering another defeat when the howitzers once more proved decisive. The gravity of potentially losing Mangus Coloradus weighed heavily on the gathered warriors. Under his leadership, the Membrano Apache had grown from a small band into a formidable force respected and feared throughout the region. Without his strategic mind and diplomatic skill, they risked losing everything they had built. Victorio, a powerful sub-chief who would later become a legendary fighter in his own right, arrived to assist. He joined young Mangus in carrying the litter, following Geronimo's lead as they began the difficult journey toward Llanos in Mexican territory. They traveled through the night, Geronimo occasionally scattering sacred pollen along their path to ease Mangus Coloradus's journey. The route took them across mountain passes and stretches of desert, a journey difficult for healthy warriors and exponentially more challenging with a wounded leader. The aging chief could barely speak, occasionally whispering instructions or observations that the bearers strained to hear. After 3 days of arduous travel, they approached the walled town of Llanos in Sonora, Mexico. Their arrival created immediate alarm. A squad of rurales, the Mexican rural police who frequently clashed with Apache raiders, formed at the gate, weapons ready, but faces showing unmistakable fear at the sight of so many Membrano warriors. Geronimo stepped forward, facing the rurales captain. "We come in peace. Our chief is wounded, and we bring him to your doctor." The captain visibly relaxed, relief replacing tension at learning this was not a raid. He dismounted and walked alongside Geronimo and the litter bearers, leading them toward the doctor's house. Townspeople scattered before them, ducking into doorways or fleeing down side streets at the unprecedented sight of Apache warriors within their walls. "They come in peace," the captain called out to his frightened countrymen. "They only seek medical help for their wounded chief." The news spread rapidly through Llanos, and residents flocked to the church. These same people who had previously prayed for Mangus Coloradus's death now fervently prayed for his recovery, fearing that his demise within their town would bring devastating retribution upon them all. At the doctor's house, most warriors remained outside while Geronimo, the captain, and the litter bearers carried Mangus Coloradus inside. The doctor, a lean man whose hair showed the first streaks of gray, appeared startled but composed at the sight of the legendary Apache leader on his doorstep. "Heal him," Geronimo stated simply. The doctor examined the wound with professional detachment, then instructed them to place Mangus Coloradus on his table. The chief remained fully conscious and aware, meeting the doctor's eyes with the stoic acceptance of a man who had faced death many times throughout his long life. The room filled with tension as the doctor probed the wound. The Apache warriors maintained impassive expressions while internally wrestling with anxiety. Captain Ruiz of the Rurales breathed heavily, sweat beading on his forehead, as he contemplated the consequences, should the chief die under the doctor's care. Only the doctor and Mangus Coloradus himself maintained complete composure. As the physician explored the wound, he shook his head doubtfully, causing Captain Ruiz to gasp audibly. The doctor turned and sternly commanded him to remain silent. For 2 hours, the doctor worked carefully to extract the bullet lodged near Mangus Coloradus's lung. He applied medicinal salves to the wound and bandaged it securely. When he finished, he addressed the anxious group gathered around his table. "He will live," the doctor pronounced. The simple statement carried enormous significance, not just for the Apache, but for the town of Llanos as well. Had Mangus Coloradus died during treatment, the warriors would likely have exacted a terrible revenge on the townspeople. Instead, the Membrano Apache departed as peacefully as they had arrived, a remarkable occurrence in the violent history of Apache-Mexican relations. This journey to Llanos represented a pivotal moment in Apache history. By seeking help from their traditional enemies, Geronimo demonstrated pragmatic flexibility that transcended tribal enmities when necessary. The willingness to utilize Mexican medical knowledge, rather than rely solely on traditional healing practices, revealed an adaptability that would characterize Geronimo's later leadership. For the residents of Llanos, the peaceful visit by a large Apache war party offered a glimpse of how relations might exist without constant bloodshed. For one brief moment, mutual need had superseded generations of conflict. As they carried their bandaged leader from Llanos to begin the journey home, none of the warriors could have predicted how this wound would alter Mangus Coloradus's perspective on resistance versus accommodation, a change that would soon create profound divisions within Apache leadership circles. The death of a leader and disagreements. Several weeks after their return from Llanos, Geronimo sat with Victorio on a hilltop overlooking the Membrano village. Though the doctor had successfully removed the bullet, Mangus Coloradus had never fully regained his strength. More troubling than his physical weakness was the change in his thinking. "Something is wrong with Mangus Coloradus," Victorio said, scanning the horizon with the habitual vigilance of a warrior. "He is not himself since the Mexican doctor treated him. Perhaps they put some spell on him." Geronimo nodded grimly. He had considered returning to Llanos to kill the doctor, but had ultimately decided against it. The wound had been too severe for complete recovery, regardless of treatment. "Yesterday, he spoke again of peace with the white eyes," Victorio continued. "He claims it is the only way for Apache to survive. This is not the Mangus Coloradus who led us against the rurals at Arispe." "When I entered his lodge last night," Geronimo replied, "he told me how pleased he was to see Delgadito again." He paused, watching Victorio's reaction. "Delgadito has been dead for 6 years. Victorio shuddered visibly. Like most Apache, he feared communication with the dead. "I cannot speak with spirits. I trust only the living and common sense. If we do not fight the Americans, they will overwhelm us just the same. Even while they war with each other, they still send soldiers to our lands." "You speak truth," Geronimo agreed. "Their numbers increase endlessly. For every white man we kill, 2 more appear." Conviction hardened Geronimo's features as he continued. "We must fight until they are driven from our land, or until all Apache are dead. Consider the misery of living as their captives, hearing them call us dirty diggers and red devils." Geronimo recounted how the Apache had once helped Americans against Mexico, only to be betrayed afterward. "Remember when Bartlett took away our Mexican slaves, claiming it was against his God's will? Yet the Americans themselves owned millions of slaves. They pay Mexico for Apache land, then claim they bought us along with it." Victorio listened intently before responding. "We must fight, but the Membrano warriors still follow Mangus Coloradus. Let us speak with him once more. Perhaps we can change his mind." When they reached the Membrano village, an unusual atmosphere greeted them. People gathered in the central clearing where Mangus Coloradus stood, surrounded by tribal members. Beside him stood a bearded white man Geronimo recognized as Jack Swilling, a longtime resident of the Southwest who spoke passable Apache. Mangus Coloradus, though 72 years old, stood straight as he addressed his people. "I have always thought first of our nation. Endless war brings only suffering." He gestured toward Swilling. This messenger comes from Captain Sherlin of the American Army, inviting us to come under a flag of truce. The captain promises the Membrano will have our own reservation with food provisions. I believe him and will lead those who wish to follow toward peace and plenty. Geronimo rushed forward and knelt before the chief. Think carefully, Great One. To become a prisoner of the White Eyes would bring terrible dishonor. It is a trap, Victorio added from behind. Mangus Coloradus looked down at Geronimo with the dignity of long leadership. You are too hot-blooded, both of you. Only experience can teach wisdom. Now stand aside so I may pass. With that, Mangus Coloradus departed the village, accompanied by numerous followers who trusted his judgment above all others. 6 nights later, young Diablo returned alone. The teenage warrior had accompanied Mangus Coloradus as part of his personal guard. Now he stood before the remaining Membrano, his face hollow with horror. We entered the soldier camp under the white flag as promised. Diablo reported, his voice barely audible. The soldiers seized Mangus Coloradus immediately, binding him like a common prisoner. They locked the rest of us in an abandoned horse corral. Diablo described how a Colonel West, outranking Captain Sherlin, arrived at the camp and spoke privately with the soldiers. Later that night, the guards untied Mangus Coloradus and departed, leaving only 2 sentries. Exhausted and weakened, the elderly chief lay down near the campfire to sleep. One soldier heated his bayonet in the fire until it glowed red. Diablo continued, his voice breaking. He touched it to Mangus Coloradus, who jumped up and ran. 2 shots rang out. Diablo fell silent, staring into the fire. No one needed to hear more. Mangus Coloradus, the leader who had brought the Membrano Apache to the height of their power, lay dead, murdered under a flag of truce. In the shocked silence that followed, Geronimo's face set into lines that would become familiar to American military commanders over the next 25 years. The betrayal of Mangus Coloradus crystallized his resolve. While others might waver between resistance and accommodation, Geronimo would choose the warrior's path until his last breath. The murder of Mangus Coloradus hardened Geronimo's resolve, transforming him into the soldier's most formidable adversary. The peaceful trader who witnessed tragedy at Cascaya had only begun his evolution into a resistance leader. His greatest battles and most crucial decisions still lay ahead, as his journey would continue through a decades-long struggle against the expanding American empire, a story of defiance that was far from over.